Namaskar and good morning. Let me begin by thanking Mr. Sanjay Kirloskar for his very kind words of introduction and welcome. I've had the honor of knowing him for quite some time, and it's a great pleasure to reconnect. My greetings also to Sri Sanjeev Goenka ji, convener of the Conclave, Rekha Sethi ji, Secretary General of IMA, whom I've known since we just met at the lobby since I was first Secretary Commercial in Paris in the early 1990s, and all the distinguished members of IMA and all of our friends who are present here. Amitabh Kantji, G20 Sherpa, has just spoken to you about our G20 presidency. And indeed, as Mr. Kirloskar just mentioned, our presidency comes at a time of great global uncertainty, global flux. There is a great deal of apprehension about how matters would proceed at a global level. And in this scenario, I think this is the scenario in which we have really assumed presidency of the G20. A few months ago, the IMF Managing Director, Kristalina Georgieva, was here. And she described the global situation as being shock after shock after shock. In other words, the COVID-19 pandemic has been the greatest shock to the international system since the Second World War. The Ukraine conflict has also really been, in many senses, the first time that Europe has seen conflict in the last 3 decades. And if you look at it as an all-out military conflagration, then we are looking at really the first time that such a conflict has happened in Europe, in the European theatre, since the Second World War. And of course, she also referred to faltering momentum in achieving the Sustainable Development Goals as well as on climate change objectives. In fact, there has been some regression in these areas in certain cases. In terms of the economy, the global economy also, clearly these crises have impacted on the global economy. There's a falling GDP. GDP has really fallen from 6% in 2021 to 3.2% this year, probably fall further to 2.7% next year. We've seen spikes in inflation. And of course, in many senses, if you look at the fact that today the world is interlinked and interconnected, nothing brings home that fact more than the impact that all of these crises have on the developing world. You may be thousands of kilometers from the epicenter of conflict or disease, but you're equally affected as anybody else. And in the global south, we have seen clearly not only falling demand for goods and services and lowering remittances, but also an increasing tendency towards indebtedness. IMF statistics say that 350 million people in about 80 countries across the world are facing acute food shortages. 60% of low-income countries are either experiencing debt or are at acute high risk of debt distress. So clearly, the global scenario is not the most optimistic. And especially, I think the impact especially felt on the developing world. And that is a matter of concern. Of course, there are signs of some revival of the economy. Inflation has come down from a high of 8.8% last year to about 6% this year. Might further slow down to about 5% next year. And the silver lining in all of this is that 4/5 of global growth today is from the developing world, comes from the developing world, out of which India alone accounts for 15% of global growth. So we are, in many senses, a bright spot in the global economy. What is our situation as we go on to take on presidency of the G20? I think in many senses, we are clearly the fastest growing large economy in the world. We have also come out of COVID as a resilient economy. We have made some fairly dramatic progress in terms of digital transformations. We are, in terms of adoption of fintech, we have the highest rates of adoption in the world. Prime Minister at Bali, at the G20 summit in Bali, pointed out that 40% of global digital transactions came from UPI, which means that we in India accounted for at least 40% of total global digital transactions. We have contributed by way of renewable energy, both solar and wind now. We are also a nation of young people. The startup culture has taken root. We now have over 1,000 startups. We are going into unicorns and decacorns, and I think that progress in that area is also very, very significant. And of course, if you look at the fact that during COVID times, some of us would remember that we faced acute shortages of the equipment that was most needed at that time. Masks, PPE kits, ventilators. But government and industry came together, and industry collaborated to ramp up production of these items. And today, whether it is liquid medical oxygen or ventilators or PPE kits, India today is not only producing but exporting to the world. So we have worked on resilient and stable supply chains. We have worked on creating an Atmanirbhar Bharat, which is ramping up domestic capacities in a manner that not only helps us, but also enables us to help the rest of the world. Of course, when we look at all of this, what does all of this mean in terms of foreign policy, in terms of where we are today and where we are headed? Well, one factor is there, which has been a consistent factor in our foreign policy in the last few years, has been to work, in some senses, to work for the global common good, to contribute in a meaningful way to not only our own growth and development, but to help countries all over the world. And this was very well illustrated during the COVID times, when we supplied, despite our own domestic demand, over 190 countries with medicines. We supplied vaccines under Vaccine Maitri program to a number of countries, especially in the developing world and in our own neighborhood. We have also been, in many senses, first responders and net security providers in the Indo-Pacific region. No doubt we'll be discussing more on that. But whether it is a call for help due to natural calamities or due to instances of pollution or any other help that our neighbors need, I think we are first off the mark, whether it is in Indonesia or whether it is in Mozambique. India has been a first responder and net security provider in the Indo-Pacific region. It was, I think, in the early days of the COVID pandemic that the Prime Minister actually made a call for the G20 to meet to discuss how they could assist in this difficult time. Saudi Arabia was the president of the G20 that time, and they convened an extraordinary summit of the G20. And at that summit, the Prime Minister said, this is the first time that the G20 has met on an issue that's not purely economic or financial in nature, but a humanitarian issue. And he called for a human-centric globalization. So our approach was to work towards a human-centric globalization, help other countries in a way that is helpful for humanity. And at that time, of course, you would recall that the G20 took some momentous decisions, including the debt service suspension initiative, by which developing countries that could not repay their debts or interest on debt were provided a moratorium during COVID times, right up to the end of 2021. So it was quite a momentous time, and momentous decisions were taken. We've also contributed globally to building capacities through the International Solar Alliance, helping developing countries build their solar power capacities. We have created another international organization called the Coalition for Disaster Resilient Infrastructure that has enabled countries to withstand or build infrastructure that can withstand natural calamities, especially helpful in the developing world and in the small island countries. Our own global assistance, our lines of credit have gone up from about 14 billion, have doubled to about $30 billion today. And I think that also is an illustration of our work within our own neighborhood, where we talk about Sabka Saath, Sabka Vikas, Sabka Vishwas, and today Sabka Prayas. We also refer to the neighborhood as part of that effort. It's not just India, but we have to carry our own immediate neighborhood along in that endeavor of the Prime Minister's call for Sabka Vikas. So development assistance has been high on that scheme of things. Now, in the month of December last year, India took on the presidency of 3 important international organizations. The first was the UN Security Council. We also were president of the Shanghai Cooperation Organization. We still are president of that organization. And we assumed presidency of the G20. We had reached, in many senses, the global high table. And I think if you look at the fact that whether it is a global conference on democracy, whether it's a global conference on climate change, whether it's terrorism or issues dealing with international peace and security, the Prime Minister, India, has always been invited to meetings and conferences of heads of state and government on any of these issues. And I think that is undoubtedly due to the stature the Prime Minister has acquired globally. Today, his opinions are sought, whether it is by the Quad, whether it is by the G7, whether it's by BRICS or by the SCO, or even by the I2U2, which is a new construct that we are part of. We straddle the global space, from the developing world to the developed world to the developing world, from the north to the south. And one of the very key elements of that engagement has been our involvement with the developing world, the global south. Dr. Jaishankar, our External Affairs Minister, said that India is perceived to be a voice of the global south. And it is in that context that India convened a meeting of some 125 developing countries in January. And the Prime Minister himself engaged with heads of state and government of these countries. And the endeavor was to find out from them, in this difficult global situation, in these difficult global times, what are their views, what are their concerns, and what are their expectations of India's leadership of the G20 and other global organizations. And I think the response in many senses has been overwhelming, and I think many of the countries have been able to articulate to us how they see many of the areas. And needless to say, in our approach as president of the G20, we will factor in those aspects, whether it is financial inclusion, whether it is lifestyle for environment, whether it is a question of how to address the issue of indebtedness, the restructuring of the Bretton Woods institutions, what can we do to take the SDGs forward, how can we contribute towards accelerated, sustainable, inclusive growth. These are the areas that we will certainly work on. But today, as I said, as we sit on the high table where the opinions and views of the Prime Minister are greatly valued by leaders across the world, I think we are very well placed to take on the presidency of the G20. Our theme of Vasudhaiva Kutumbakam, one earth, one family, one future, I think says it all. This is our approach to foreign policy. This is our approach to the G20. And in many senses, as the Prime Minister had stated at the Independence Day event at the Red Fort last year, he said, this is indeed our moment. India's moment has come. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Ambassador Shringla. We'll have a Q&A, and I'll start with the first one or two questions, and then we'll open it up to the audience. As we all know, we're here at a time of conflict and disagreements between two major powers, the US and Russia. So what is our strategy to bring the focus of the G20 back to international economic stability, growth, sustainable development, and security?
Well, it is true that the polarizations, the global polarizations that have come about largely due to the Ukraine issue, cuts across the G20. You know, the G20 is a very representative body. It has the largest developed and emerging economies represented. It's got the G7 membership. It's got the P5, the permanent members of the Security Council. It's got Russia and China. But it's also got a range of emerging market economies, Brazil and Argentina, Turkey, South Africa, Saudi Arabia, Indonesia, ourselves. So in many senses, it's a very representative body. But because it is representative, I think polarizations that are global can also cut across. And really today's polarizations cut directly across the G20. And so that divide that we saw in Indonesia continues obviously to exist today. For us, what is important is that there is a very, very major agenda out there. As I mentioned, I mean, our concern is the concern of countries across the world. There is a great deal of expectation from the G20. I mean, the UN clearly is now deadlocked. It's not able to take decisions on issues that are critical. Other bodies have also not risen up to the occasion. The G20, when it achieves consensus, can really come up with decisions that can make a difference across the globe, whether it's in times of financial and economic crisis, or it's in terms of contributing towards macroeconomic stability. It can contribute. It is essentially not a political body. It is a body that is there to provide a framework of policy decisions that really resonate across the world. Because we have to remember that the UN, the IMF, the World Bank, the OECD are all parts of the G20. I mean, they're all components of the G20. They attend all the meetings of the G20. So G20 decisions really are those that are easy to implement once they're taken. And our, let us say, rationale, our reasoning with our partners in the G20 is that there is a very large agenda out there. Countries across the world are facing the brunt of today's crises and today's uncertain global situation. And the G20 has to rise up to the occasion. We have to contribute towards solutions to global challenges, whether it is the lack of growth, whether it is faltering SDGs, whether it is a lack of movement on climate change, whether it is an issue of restructuring international global organizations, whether it is also a question of, contributing towards women-led development. I mean, these are issues that are there. They are also part of our broad priorities in the G20. And I think in many senses, our priorities have been formulated based on feedback from countries all over the world, in particular the Global South. As I said, the Voice of Global South conference gave us a very important sense of the urgency and the expectations of the developing world, and how can we contribute towards making that difference through the G20 that is there. So our presidency has been geared up to working on our partners, really reasoning with them and trying to develop consensus on issues that are important. If you saw the meeting of the finance ministers in Bangalore, the meeting of the foreign ministers in Delhi, both these meetings had a consensual chair's summary on all paragraphs except the Ukraine paragraphs. In other words, on every issue that's important to the world and important to the G20, we have achieved a certain level of consensus. And our endeavor is to continue to build on that consensus, work with all our partners and stakeholders, and take it to a level where responses to global challenges can come about in a manner that is expected by the rest of the world.
Thank you. You mentioned some of these old institutions like the UN, the IMF, and they basically, I think, reflect the realities of the post-Second World War era, and very difficult to reform. I was wondering, and maybe I'm just changing a tack a little bit, should India try and expand the scope and size of the Quad and turn it into a global alliance for security and trade?
Well, so far the Quad is what it says it is. It's the Quad. It's 4 nations. And we have always looked at the Quad as a force for global good. In other words, that when we work on the Indo-Pacific, we work with our Quad partners to develop a free, open, transparent, inclusive Indo-Pacific, which is in keeping with the principles, both India and our partners in the Quad. We have also obviously tried to look at what works best for the Indo-Pacific. How can we co-opt other countries in the Indo-Pacific in a positive manner? If you remember, one of the first initiatives that the Quad took was the vaccine initiative. The idea was to have US vaccines manufactured in India, transported by Japan, and last mile provision by Australia. And I think in many senses, we successfully provided vaccines to countries in Southeast Asia, Cambodia, Thailand, other countries that needed it. Of course, at that time, the demand for vaccines was already waning, but the Quad came up. Today, the Quad has spread to areas across the board. We are cooperating in space, new and emerging technologies, on climate change, on areas like semiconductors. I think that level of cooperation is extensive. It's multifaceted in many senses, and I think there is a certain level of a great deal of convergence on the areas that we are working on. But it is still, you have to remember, it's still a nascent organization. After all, the first meeting of the Quad took place in 2021 after President Biden, first meeting of the leaders took place in early 2021 after President Biden took office. It was a virtual meeting. Later that year, the Quad met for the first time in person, the Quad leaders in Washington, D.C. And that was the first time that the Quad leaders had ever met. And of course, it's been followed up by the Tokyo meeting, and I think there are a number of other meetings that are there. Australia would be the next host. So Quad is a new organization. It needs time to develop and ensure that it has its own convergences, that it makes an impact on the Indo-Pacific and other partners before, I think, this is my personal view, and I'm making it very clear that it's personal, before it can consider an expansion to include other like-minded partners and stakeholders.
Take a question from the audience. This is from Mr. Manjul Kumar. That's for you. Who is working for human-centric globalization, the G7 or the G20? Do you see a conflict of interest between G7 and G20? If it is there, how can we work? If it is there, then now how can we work for human-centric globalization? More than.
So,
if it is more than now, how can we work for human-centric globalization?
Right. So when you talk about the Quad and you talk about G7, of course, and G20, in many senses, there was a perception that the G20 was largely dominated by the G7. I think today it is, I would say, in that perception is changing because after all, Indonesia has been till recently president of the G20. We have taken over the presidency. After us, Brazil will take over the presidency, and after Brazil, it will be South Africa. So it's the IPSA countries that essentially, have the presidency one after the other. It is also developing countries that have hold the presidency on 4 consecutive years. And that imprint to the developing world in the G20's outcomes and their own deliberations, I think, will be very, very significant. And of course, it does not mean to say that you don't work, you work across the board, because G20 is not an organization in which any one country can decide on the outcomes. You, as the president, you can decide on the agenda, but the outcomes have to be consensual in nature. Even one country can get up and say, I don't agree with you, and doesn't fly. So we have to work very closely with all of our partners, our friends in the G20 to develop consensus. And I think from that point of view, whether it's the G7 or it is the emerging economies or it's Russia and China, I think we have to work to strive for convergences, work to develop consensus, and whatever we want to do in our presidency, it has to be with all concerned. So first and foremost, I think the G20 is certainly more democratized and more broad-based in its deliberations and its outcomes. Secondly, of course, I think the G7's contribution, as also other members, has always been there. As far as the Quad is concerned, and as far as human-centric globalization is concerned, I think this is an area where you can really work with all concerned. It's not an area where anybody would say that any organization or any group of countries would say this does not fit in with our agenda. Today, when you talk to the Americans on human-centric globalization, you talk to the UN, you talk to the Japanese or the Europeans or our partners in the Gulf, everybody will agree that working towards a human-centric globalization, the approach that the Prime Minister formulated is very, very, I would say, has a great deal of traction and is very well appreciated. How do we do that? How do we move that forward? I think is certainly something that is work in progress. We have seen a great deal of that, as I said, in the Quad. The Quad has worked towards areas that involve a certain human-centric approach. I think the G20 also, under our presidency, will see a great deal of that. I mean, many of the outcomes that we're going to see will be in the form of how we can push a human-centric approach, whether it is involving a global partnership on financial inclusion, or it is a reform of the multilateral financial institutions in order to make them to strengthen their mandate, make them more effective in the 21st century. These are areas that we will work with others, and we will work with the objective of ensuring a human-centric globalization. The ultimate objective is always that.
The G7 as a bloc has been together for a much longer period than the G20. Do you see any areas of conflict where, this body of the G7 countries are ranged against the rest of the countries in the G20, especially with China and Russia now? I mean, they're not part of the G7, but a lot of the other countries seem to be independent, and getting everyone together must be a tough job then.
I think it's definitely a fact that the G7 has been there longer. They're more organized. They have a strong secretariat backing from the OECD. And in many senses, their meetings have been far more. And of course, it's a more cohesive grouping than the G20. But the fact is that, the beauty of the G20 is that you have different shades of opinion, but you need to come together to make sure that there is a G20 opinion at the end of it. So there is no doubt that in many senses, the G7 has its own priorities. I mean, as a developing country bloc, it's got its own priorities. The emerging economies have their own priorities. Russia and China also have their own priorities. But a synthesis of that is what the G20 is. And that's why it's consensual, that's why it's global, and that's why today it is one of the most representative groupings in the world. And which is why, as we assume presidency of the G20, we can really make that critical difference that the world expects of us. Having said that, of course, we are also, please keep in mind that the Prime Minister has been invited to practically every G7 summit. We are almost like permanent invitees in the G7. We participate in their deliberations, we contribute, and as I said, the Prime Minister's views, his opinions are greatly valued and sought after. And so we are engaged with the G7. We are engaged with, as I said, with BRICS and SCO also. We straddle that global space. At the same time, of course, we, under our presidency, have also engaged separately with the G7. Japan is taking over the chair of the G7. We are in touch with Japan. We were in touch with Germany earlier. And as president of the SCO, we already represent the SCO. So we are taking care to ensure that we are consulting very closely with all the different components of the G20 in, again, securing our larger objectives for us and for the rest of the world.
One more question from the audience. This is from Nikhil Soni. Does the Ministry of External Affairs have guidance on what business Indian firms can do with Russia? And what happens if an Indian company is sanctioned?
So again, I want to clarify that I don't speak for the Ministry of External Affairs, so I don't think what I say would be my personal views. It is undoubtedly a fact that, ironical fact that, after the current situation, in many senses, our import-export figures with Russia have increased, and that's primarily because of the import of petroleum and petroleum products from Russia, but also in many senses we have managed to keep up our exports. The sanctions, I mean, we are talking about unilateral sanctions on Russia, are a complex array of sanctions, and I think there are areas where you can indulge in trade and exchanges of an economic nature, and there are areas where you need not. I think one has to really very carefully examine those sanctions, and it has also, I think it has to also be looked at from a legal standpoint, because what appears to be a clear-cut area where you can trade or you can deal with Russia on certain areas may not actually be interpreted that way. There are secondary sanctions that can apply. All of us and many of the companies that are represented here have exposure in the Western world as well. So I would say that there is within the scope and within the limitations of the sanction, there is really no bar on the sort of economic exchanges you can have with Russia. But at the same time, whatever you do should be very carefully examined to ensure that you are not directly or indirectly contravening any of the sanctions that are in place by the United States, Europe, and many other countries that have imposed these sanctions on entities dealing with Russia. So I think that has to be very, very carefully observed.
The next question is from Dr. Labh Singh of the Calcutta Management Association, I believe, CMA. India is tryst with destiny 2047, but SDG mission is 2030. How will the gap in time and development space be bridged, given India's border issues with China and Pakistan?
So the question is on the SDGs, I imagine.
Yeah.
But at the same time, it does involve our neighbors. Well, I mean, it's very clear that, we are in the middle of the SDG process. We are at the halfway point. And while it started well, but I think COVID and the Ukraine issue did play spoiler. And in many senses, I think today we are faltering. And the SDGs are important not only for the world, it's also important for us. I mean, attaining socio-economic indicators and this, of course, is a very important gauge of global progress. It is not just the GDPs of countries, it is also the social and socio-economic progress that has to be very carefully monitored. So I think the fact that we are really losing the momentum of SDGs is not good news. I think the world needs to come together to provide solutions that can ensure that we continue on that track. We are working with all of our partners through the finance track, through the Sherpa track, in developing solutions that can really contribute towards keeping the SDG momentum on track. All I can say now is that this is work in progress and it involves extensive discussions, negotiations over several rounds of meetings until we reach the summit in September. And I think that effort is on. With regard to our own immediate neighbors, obviously there are issues that we have. These are not of our own making. And I think whether it is the threat of terrorism from Pakistan or whether it is the issue of unresolved activity on our boundary with China in 2020, these are issues that we have to certainly keep in mind. With regard to Pakistan, of course, I think until there is satisfaction on issues that are of core concern to us, obviously that limits any movement that we can have at a bilateral level. With regard to China, clearly, it is still after 15 rounds of talks between senior commanders and at the diplomatic levels, you still have areas where you need resolution. Obviously, as our External Affairs Minister said, progress has been achieved, but there are still outstanding issues, and unless those issues are resolved, I find it difficult to look at it as business as usual and conduct normal diplomatic relations with our northern neighbor. Of course, China is a part of the G20. We are obviously including them in all of our meetings. That's part of our deliberations. But we do have, at a bilateral level, an outstanding issue. And unless, obviously, peace and tranquility is restored in our border areas, in many senses, these violations have taken place in contravention of past agreements. There are issues that are out there, and those need to be resolved.
Is a multipolar world inevitable, despite the resistance by the US to that? And what would a multipolar world look like if and when it does become a reality?
Well, I mean, I would say that from our perspective, we would like to see a multipolar world. A multipolar world in which, there are a number of poles and these poles cooperate and there is a larger level of balance and equilibrium in the global level. We have seen a bipolar world. We have seen a unilateral moment with the United States standing as the sole, I would say, superpower. Today, that unipolar moment is fading. We are seeing the rise of China, but we are also seeing other poles. We ourselves are an important pole. And we believe that, start with Asia, there should be a multipolar Asia with India as one of the poles. But also at a global level, we would like to see multiple poles that all contribute towards global development and contribute towards the global common good. And that is the ideal framework that we would like to see. I think, in our view, a unipolar or a bipolar world, and especially a bipolar situation where there are two poles, is not a good scenario and takes us back to the era of the Cold War. You need a far greater balance in global affairs, in global governance, and in levels of global cooperation And that balance can only come when you have different countries across the globe assuming a certain level of prominence, a certain level of leadership, and a certain commitment to contributing to the global common good as India itself is committed to doing.
I think it looks like there's an inflection point, with the way West Asia is moving away from America. You saw China mediate between Russia, Iran and Saudi Arabia. Last night's news about Egypt wanting to supply warheads to Russia, despite all the aid that Egypt gets from the US. And the other statement made by President Macron about Taiwan not being their problem. Does it look like things are slowly but surely changing?
Well, I mean, look at it from a certain larger global point of view. There is a rebalancing at a global level. The United States accounted for about 35% of global GDP at around the time of the Second World War. Today, it accounts for about 15% of global GDP. Growth, GDP, economy, technology is shifting from the global north towards Asia. And I think in some senses, this is good news because we are beneficiaries of that transformation, that shift. And all of us have grown, in a certain sense, grown quickly, assumed a certain level of prominence in economic matters, in scientific and technological developments. Quickly, we've been benefited from very, very sound political leadership over the last decade or so. And despite many of the challenges that have come our way, whether it's COVID or whether it is any of the conflicts in our area, you mentioned Pakistan and China. We have seen Afghanistan on our western borders, Myanmar on our eastern borders implode. And so we, in our foreign policy, in our conduct of affairs, have had to, play the international, I would say, arena very, very carefully. Foreign policy has been calibrated to ensure that we come out, despite the adversity and challenges, come out on top of things. And I think that is very important. So India has grown disproportionately, and today we are very fortunate. We are a young country, we are an optimistic country, we are looking forward. It's in many senses a generation that is looking forward with a great deal of expectation from the future. We have entered into what is described as a period of Amrit Kal. By the year 2047, we want to see ourselves as a developed economy. And I think we have really set the ground for that development, that journey from the Azadi Ka Amrit Mahotsav to Amrit Kal in 2047. But it is not many of us in this room who will deliver. It's the young people, the youth of our country that will deliver. If you're 25 today, by the time we reach 2047, you'll be 50 years old. But that is the generation that is really going to deliver on this journey and this promise of taking us to a developed world. But I'm sure, and I have no doubt, that in this global equilibrium and balancing, India will be one of the poles of a multipolar world.
Thank you. I think I've been getting enough indications. Thank you very much, Ambassador Shringla, for being here with us this morning and not only delivering your keynote address, but also answering so many questions that came from the audience. Thank you very much.
Thank you, sir, and thanks to all the audience here.